On the 4th of July in 1831, New York seemed determined to remind everyone that America was still young. Church bells moved across the rooftops. Cannon fire rolled in from the harbor. Families filled the streets beneath the heavy summer air. Yet above all that celebration, inside a modest house on Prince Street, an old man was slowly losing his ability to breathe. His name was James Monroe. He was 73 years old. And once, much of the country had waited for his words. Now even a single breath demanded nearly all the strength he had left. There was something almost unsettling about the contrast. Outside, people celebrated the birth of a nation. Inside, one of the men who had helped defend that nation during its fragile beginning was approaching death. History usually shows us presidents standing beneath bright lights, surrounded by flags, soldiers, advisors, and applause. It rarely shows us the quiet room afterward. It rarely asks us to imagine the tired body beneath the famous name. If these slower journeys through history speak to you, you can subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more stories about the people behind the monuments. Monroe was no longer living in the grand surroundings people might expect from a former president. He was staying with his daughter Maria and her husband in New York. Illness had narrowed his world until the bedroom itself had become almost an entire country. The window stood open, hoping to catch a breeze from the summer afternoon. Maria remained close to the bed. Doctors had little left to offer. There was no speech to prepare, no cabinet decision waiting, no diplomatic letter demanding an answer. There was only the uneven rhythm of breathing and the silence that came between one breath and the next. His health had been failing for months. A relentless illness had settled into his lungs and slowly taken possession of his days. Sleeping became difficult. Eating became tiring. Conversation required effort. The same man who had survived military campaigns, ocean voyages, political battles, and years of exhausting public service now found himself defeated by something that could not be negotiated with. There was no treaty to sign with sickness. No election could remove it. No army could drive it away. Each morning simply brought another small surrender. Another piece of strength disappearing without ceremony. And there was grief as well. Less than a year earlier, his wife Elizabeth had died. They had shared more than 4 decades of life together. She had known him before the presidency, before the highest honors, before the name Monroe carried the weight of national power. Together, they had crossed oceans, endured separations, raised children, faced financial trouble, and watched friends become legends. When she died, something familiar disappeared from his world. A house can remain standing after someone leaves it, but that does not mean it still feels like home. Without Elizabeth, the rooms of Oak Hill seemed filled with absence. Furniture remained where it had always been. Sunlight still entered through the windows. Doors opened into the same halls. But grief has a strange way of changing the size of a place. A room once made warm by another person can suddenly feel enormous. Monroe eventually left Virginia and went to live with Maria. The former president had spent much of his life serving a nation that was growing larger every year. Yet his own world was becoming smaller. In the end, it had narrowed to family, memory, and breath. There is something deeply human in that image. Power had once brought strangers to his door. Politicians had sought his approval. Diplomats had measured his expressions. Military officers had waited for instructions. Now none of that could comfort him. The people who remained were not there because of his office. They were there because he was a father, a widower, an old man they loved. Perhaps this is one of history's quietest truths. Titles can follow a person for decades, but eventually, life removes them one by one until only the person underneath is left. Around 3 in the afternoon, while Independence Day celebrations continued through the city, James Monroe stopped breathing. There was no grand final declaration recorded for future generations, no carefully shaped sentence that could be carved beneath a statue. His body had simply reached its limit. Outside, bells continued to ring. Cannon salutes continued to echo. America celebrated another year of existence, while one of the last presidents, shaped directly by the revolutionary generation, passed away in an upstairs room. The moment was quiet, but the date made it impossible for people to see his death as ordinary. 5 years earlier, on the 4th of July in 1826, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams had both died. Now, Monroe had died on the same day. 3 early presidents, each connected to the founding era, had left the world on the anniversary of American independence. Perhaps it was only coincidence. History contains many strange accidents of timing, yet human beings rarely leave such patterns alone. We look for meaning in dates, because dates seem to give shape to chaos. We wonder whether certain endings are simply endings, or whether they somehow belong to the stories that came before them. For Monroe, the symbolism was especially powerful. He had been one of the last presidents who could remember the revolution, not as history, but as experience. He remembered a time when there was no United States, as later generations understood it. Independence had once been uncertain. Victory had once seemed unlikely. The Constitution had not yet been written. The government that would later stretch across a continent had once been little more than an argument carried by frightened men through war. Monroe had lived long enough to watch that fragile experiment become a nation, and powerful enough to make declarations to Europe. But the distance between the young revolutionary and the dying former president had not been smooth. His life contained victories, humiliations, friendships, betrayals, ambition, devotion, and contradictions that never fully disappeared. He had fought for liberty while living in a society sustained by slavery. He had spoken about the future of Republican government while remaining tied to customs inherited from colonial Virginia. He had helped enlarge the territory of the United States while struggling to manage his own finances. He had reached the highest political office in the country, yet he would die, burdened by debt, in the home of his daughter. One physical reminder of his youth had followed him through nearly all of it. During the Revolutionary War, while still a very young officer, Monroe had been struck by a musket ball. The wound nearly killed him. The metal could not be safely removed, so part of that battlefield remained lodged in his body for the rest of his life. Through diplomatic receptions, government meetings, family dinners, political disputes, and years in the White House, the old wound traveled with him. The revolution was not merely something he remembered. In a strange and literal way, he carried a fragment of it beneath his skin. Perhaps most lives contain something similar, though not always in the form of metal. Sometimes we carry a loss that changes the way we trust. Sometimes we carry a failure that quietly shapes every decision afterward. Sometimes it is a promise made when we were young, or a memory we never speak about because words would make it too real. Monroe carried wounds that could be seen and others that could not. To understand the man who died in New York that summer afternoon, we must return to the time before anyone knew his name. We must go back to Virginia in 1758, to a world of tobacco fields, muddy roads, broad rivers, wooden houses, wealthy planters, struggling farmers, enslaved families, and distant imperial power. We must return to a society that spoke of order while resting upon profound inequality. There, along the northern neck of Virginia, a child was born into a respectable family that was comfortable but far from the highest rank of colonial aristocracy. He was not born a president. He was not born a statesman. He was simply James Monroe, the second son of a planter, beginning a life whose direction no one could yet see. Virginia, in 1758, was a place where beauty and contradiction lived beside each other so closely that people rarely stopped to separate them. Rivers moved slowly toward the Chesapeake Bay. Tobacco fields spread beneath humid skies. Forests of oak, pine, and hickory stood between cultivated land along the waterways. Boats carried crops toward larger ships bound for Britain. From a distance, the colony could appear peaceful and prosperous. Yet much of that prosperity rested on people who had no freedom at all. Men and women whose labor belonged to someone else. The colony had already existed for more than a century and a half. What had begun as a fragile English settlement had grown into one of the richest and most populated parts of British North America. Land meant status. Tobacco meant wealth. Access to a river could determine whether a family prospered or struggled. The great planter, families owned enormous estates and hundreds of enslaved people. Their sons were educated for leadership, and their names appeared again and again in local government. Below them lived smaller planters, tradesmen, farmers, laborers, and families, trying to climb one careful step higher. James Monroe was born into that middle world. His father, Spence Monroe, owned several hundred acres of land and worked as both a planter and a skilled carpenter. The family was comfortable, but they did not belong to the highest circle of Virginia wealth. There were larger houses nearby, older family names, wider estates, and men whose influence could open almost any political door. Young James would have grown up aware of such differences. Children often understand status before they understand the words used to describe it. They notice who gives orders and who receives them. His mother, Elizabeth Jones Monroe, came from a respected Virginia family. Together, she and Spence raised 5 children in a household shaped by the demanding rhythm of plantation life. James was the second son. That small fact mattered more than it might seem today. Under the inheritance customs of the time, the eldest son stood in the strongest position to receive the family estate. James could not assume that adulthood would simply hand him land, income, and security. Sooner or later, he would need to make a place for himself beyond the boundaries of his childhood home. Perhaps that knowledge entered him slowly. No one needs to sit a child down and explain every limit. Sometimes life teaches through arrangement. One brother stands closer to inheritance. Another understands that his future must be built elsewhere. This does not necessarily create resentment. Sometimes it creates movement. The person who cannot remain where he began starts looking outward. For James, education would become one of those paths. Before politics, before war, before diplomacy, there was simply a young boy learning that the world was larger than the fields around his family home. Daily life followed the seasons. Spring brought planting. Summer demanded constant attention beneath heavy heat. Tobacco plants rose high from the soil and required careful work. Autumn brought harvesting and curing. Winter meant sorting, packing, repairing, planning, and waiting for the cycle to begin again. James would have known the smell of drying tobacco, damp earth after rain, wood smoke in colder months, and river air moving inland. He would also have known the faces of enslaved people who worked around him every day. Bondage was not hidden from white children in Virginia. It was presented as ordinary life. That may be one of the most difficult things to understand about the world that formed him. Injustice does not always announce itself as injustice to the people benefiting from it. Sometimes it arrives disguised as tradition. Sometimes it becomes furniture in the room, something always present and therefore rarely questioned. James grew up inside a system that taught him liberty and hierarchy at the same time. Years later, he would speak uneasily about slavery and imagine gradual change. Yet he would never fully free himself from the structure that had shaped his childhood. The contradiction began long before he had words for it. When James was about 11 years old, his formal education became more serious. He was sent to a respected academy where students studied Latin, mathematics, history, rhetoric, and the classical writings considered essential for a young gentleman. Education in colonial Virginia was not simply about collecting knowledge. It was preparation for a place in society. A boy who could reason, speak clearly, read classical texts, and understand law might someday enter public life. For James, the classroom offered something the plantation could not. It opened windows toward worlds he had never seen and arguments he had never considered. Among the boys studying around him was John Marshall, another young Virginian whose name would later become deeply connected to American law. Neither boy could have known what lay ahead. That is one of the strange pleasures of looking backward through history. We see famous names sitting together before they became famous, while they themselves see only classmates, books, chores, ambitions, and ordinary mornings. Before monuments, there are always unfinished people. Before history gives someone a title, there is usually a teenager uncertain about his place in the world, carrying hopes too private for anyone else to remember. Then, when James was 16, the shape of his life changed with a cruelty that no education could prepare him for. His mother died. The surviving records do not give us every detail of her final illness or the exact emotions inside the Monroe household. History is often uneven that way. It preserves treaties and elections more carefully than grief. Yet we do not need every missing sentence to understand what the loss must have meant. A mother who had organized the domestic world was suddenly gone, leaving children, routines, responsibilities, and silence behind her. Before the family had time to settle into that absence, another death followed. Spence Monroe also died that same year. James was 16 and effectively orphaned. Within a short period, the familiar structure of childhood had collapsed. The estate passed primarily toward his older brother, while the younger children faced an uncertain future. Grief arrived together with practical questions. Where would they live? Who would guide them? What would become of James now? Life sometimes changes direction, not because someone chooses a new road, but because the old road disappears beneath their feet. At that moment, his uncle Joseph Jones became one of the most important people in his life. Jones was educated, politically connected, and familiar with men who were already becoming important figures in Virginia. He recognized intelligence and seriousness in his nephew. Instead of allowing James to drift after the deaths of his parents, he helped push him toward a larger world. Arrangements were made for the young man to continue his education at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, one of the most respected institutions in the colonies. James arrived in Williamsburg, carrying more than books. He carried fresh grief, family uncertainty, ambition, and the quiet pressure of having to build a future without the safety he once knew. The town itself was unlike the countryside of his childhood. Government officials, lawyers, merchants, students, and political leaders moved through the same streets. Conversations about taxation, British authority, colonial rights, and resistance were becoming harder to avoid. Something was changing across America. People could feel it before they could clearly name what it would become. Old loyalties were weakening, and dangerous questions were entering ordinary conversation. James had come to Williamsburg, expecting an education, but history was preparing to offer him something far less peaceful. Across the colonies, anger toward British rule was growing. Debates that had once belonged to assemblies and taverns were moving toward confrontation. Words such as liberty, rights, loyalty, rebellion, and independence began to carry consequences. For a young man who had already learned how quickly a private life could change, the larger world was about to demonstrate the same lesson. Within a short time, books would no longer be enough. James Monroe would have to decide what he was willing to risk for the ideas surrounding him. Williamsburg was supposed to educate James Monroe, but the city was becoming a classroom of a very different kind. In 1774, political arguments seemed to drift through taverns, meeting rooms, streets, and college halls like smoke. Students heard the names of distant places and unfamiliar laws repeated with growing anger. Boston Harbor had been closed. Parliament had punished Massachusetts. Colonial leaders spoke of rights that could not simply be taken away. For young men like Monroe, the question was becoming harder to avoid. How long could people talk about liberty before they were asked to defend it? The College of William and Mary remained small, disciplined, and traditional. Students attended lessons in classical literature, mathematics, philosophy, and moral reasoning, but beyond the classroom windows. The language of rebellion was becoming more urgent than anything found in an old book. Nearby, some of Virginia's most influential men gathered to discuss British policy and the future of the colonies. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and Richard Henry Lee were no longer distant names. They belonged to the political world, unfolding almost within walking distance of Monroe's studies. There is a particular age when ideas stop being abstract. At 16 or 17, a young person can still believe that courage is simple because life has not yet shown all of its costs. Monroe and his classmates talked about rights, resistance, and the possibility of armed conflict. They organized themselves into a student militia and practiced drilling on the college grounds with whatever weapons they could find. Perhaps some of it still felt adventurous in the beginning. Uniforms, formations, commands, and political excitement can make danger seem almost romantic when no one has yet seen what a real battlefield does to a body. Then news arrived from Massachusetts. Fighting had broken out at Lexington and Concord. British soldiers and colonial militia had exchanged fire. Men had died. Suddenly, the argument between Britain and its colonies had crossed an invisible line. Blood changes the meaning of political language. Words such as resistance no longer belong only to speeches. Once someone has been killed for them. In Williamsburg, the royal governor understood the danger as clearly as anyone. Before dawn in April of 1775, British Marines removed gunpowder from the public magazine. Hoping to keep military supplies away from local forces, the seizure produced exactly the fear it was meant to prevent. Militia units began preparing across Virginia. Anger spread through communities, already suspicious of British authority. Patrick Henry gathered armed men and moved toward Williamsburg, demanding that the powder be returned or paid for. The immediate confrontation ended without a larger battle. But something important had changed. Trust had become almost impossible. Both sides were beginning to act as though violence might come at any moment. Once neighbors start hiding weapons from each other, peaceful language begins to sound different. Every gesture starts to resemble preparation. Monroe did not remain a spectator. During the summer of 1775, he joined several fellow students in an act that would have been almost unimaginable only a few years earlier. They entered the governor's palace and raided its arsenal, taking roughly 200 muskets and 300 swords. Before delivering the weapons to Virginia forces, it was not a classroom exercise. It was open defiance of royal authority. Had British control been fully restored, the young men involved could have faced severe punishment. Monroe was still a teenager, yet he had already stepped beyond argument and into rebellion. Perhaps courage often begins before people fully understand what they are risking. Later generations look backward and see famous revolutionaries. The people living through the moment see uncertainty. No one, in 1775, possessed a guarantee that the colonies would win. Britain commanded one of the most powerful military systems in the world. Rebellion could end in independence, but it could also end in prison, confiscation, exile, or death. Monroe could not know which future waited ahead. He only knew that remaining neutral was becoming difficult. History had moved close enough that refusing to choose had become a choice of its own. The old academic routine slowly became impossible to preserve. Students left, professors departed, military preparations replaced ordinary college life. By the beginning of 1776, Monroe understood that his education at William and Mary would not continue as planned. He left without receiving a degree. The young man who had arrived carrying books and the hopes of his uncle now turned toward the Continental Army. He had little genuine military experience beyond local drilling. What he possessed instead was youth, physical strength, education, and a conviction that the conflict surrounding him had become his responsibility. He entered the 3rd Virginia Regiment as a young officer. It was a remarkable transformation when viewed from a distance. But perhaps it did not feel remarkable to him. Lives often change quietly while we are inside them. 1 month, we imagine one future, and a few decisions later, we are sleeping in unfamiliar places beside strangers, carrying responsibilities we never expected. Monroe had once been the second son of a modest planter, then an orphaned student, then a college youth surrounded by political debate. Now he belonged to an army whose survival was far from certain. The regiment was ordered north to reinforce George Washington. Monroe traveled through Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania with hundreds of other Virginians, moving toward a war. They understood mostly through rumor. The roads were long, supplies were uncertain. The men carried weapons, clothing, food when they had it, and whatever private fears they refused to admit aloud. There is nothing romantic about marching. For days after the excitement has faded, boots wear down, shoulders ache, weather changes without asking permission. Distance turns patriotic language into physical exhaustion. Still, the column kept moving north toward New York. By the time Monroe reached Washington's army, the situation was grim. British forces were larger, better supplied, supported by naval power, and reinforced by German soldiers fighting for the crown. Washington had attempted to hold New York, but the American position became increasingly difficult. Monroe saw combat around Harlem Heights, where the Americans managed a limited success. For a young officer entering his first true battlefield, even a small engagement must have destroyed any remaining illusion that war resembled drilling on a college lawn. Real gunfire does not arrive with philosophy. It arrives with smoke, confusion, noise, and fear. Whatever encouragement came from that fight did not change the larger reality. Washington's army was being forced backward. Through the autumn, American troops retreated across New Jersey, abandoning one position after another, while British forces followed. Men deserted. Enlistments approached their end. Supplies disappeared faster than they could be replaced. Each retreat made the revolution feel smaller. The army that had spoken so confidently of liberty now seemed to be shrinking with every cold mile. Victory was no longer the immediate question. Survival was. Could an army continue to represent a revolution if the army itself was about to vanish? By early December, Washington had taken his battered forces across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. Behind them, British troops settled into positions throughout New Jersey. Ahead of them lay uncertainty. Congress was frightened. Soldiers were preparing to leave when their enlistments ended. Winter was closing around an exhausted army. Monroe had entered the war with the intensity of youth, but now he was learning something every generation eventually discovers. Believing in a cause does not mean the cause will win. Sometimes history reaches a point where everything appears ready to collapse, and the next decision has to be made in darkness. Across the river, in the town of Trenton, more than 1,000 Hessian soldiers rested in winter quarters. Washington looked at his dwindling army and understood that waiting might be more dangerous than attacking. Something had to change before the year ended. Something had to convince exhausted soldiers that the revolution still had a future. The plan that began taking shape was reckless, difficult, and dependent upon weather, secrecy, timing, and courage, all cooperating at once. On a freezing Christmas night, James Monroe would step into a boat and cross the Delaware toward the moment that would remain inside his body for the rest of his life. The night of Christmas in 1776 was bitterly cold, and the Delaware River looked more like a moving field of broken glass than a road toward victory. Ice drifted through the black water. Freezing rain struck the soldiers as they waited for boats. Washington was asking exhausted men to cross a dangerous river in darkness, march through a winter storm, and attack before dawn. There was no certainty that the plan would work. There was only the understanding that doing nothing might be even more dangerous than attempting the impossible. James Monroe climbed into one of the boats with the others. He was still very young, but war had already made youth feel less important. The river moved beneath them, while men struggled with oars, ropes, weapons, and cold hands that were slowly losing feeling. Nobody on that water could know whether the coming morning would bring victory, capture, or death. This is one of the strange things about famous moments in history. Later, everything seems inevitable. While it is happening, everyone is simply trying to survive the next hour. After the crossing, the army still had miles to march. Wet clothing clung to the soldiers. Roads were dark and difficult. Sleet turned the ground hard and slippery. Every step carried them farther from safety. Washington divided his forces and pushed them toward Trenton, where Hessian troops were resting after Christmas. The Americans depended on surprise. If warning reached the town too early, the entire operation could collapse. By dawn, the men had been awake for hours, cold, hungry, and exhausted. Then the silence finally broke with gunfire. The attack came quickly. American forces entered Trenton from different directions, while artillery and musket fire echoed between houses. The Hessian soldiers had not expected an army to move through such weather. Confusion spread through the town as officers tried to organize resistance. Monroe was given a dangerous task. He and a small group were sent toward enemy artillery before the guns could be fully brought into action. It was the kind of order that sounds simple when written on paper. Reach the guns. Stop them. In reality, it meant running directly toward men, preparing to fire. Monroe moved forward with his soldiers through the frozen streets. Smoke filled the air. Commands disappeared beneath gunfire. Men slipped, shouted, fired, and kept moving. Then something struck Monroe in the left shoulder with tremendous force. For a moment, pain must have been less clear than shock. A musket ball had torn into him and damaged a major artery. Blood began to pour from the wound. In another place, or with another few minutes of delay, the story of James Monroe might have ended there. Before diplomacy, before politics, before the presidency, chance sometimes enters history, wearing the face of an ordinary person standing nearby. A military surgeon reached Monroe quickly enough to understand what was happening. The bleeding had to be stopped immediately. There was no hospital room, no careful preparation, no quiet team of doctors. There was only a wounded young officer, a freezing street, and a battle still unfolding around them. The surgeon tied off the damaged artery and managed to slow the loss of blood. Monroe survived. He had entered Trenton as a young soldier, searching for victory. He left it carrying a wound that would never fully leave him. The Americans won at Trenton, capturing hundreds of Hessian soldiers along with weapons and supplies. Strategically, it was not the largest battle of the Revolution, but emotionally, it arrived at the exact moment the army needed something to believe in. Only days earlier, defeat had seemed almost natural. Men were leaving. Confidence was collapsing. Now, Washington had shown that the British and their allies could be surprised and beaten. For Monroe, the victory came at a personal cost. He had nearly bled to death before his 19th birthday, and the metal that entered his shoulder remained there. The musket ball could not be safely removed. Doctors feared that trying to take it out might cause more damage than leaving it alone. So, Monroe carried that small piece of war inside his body for decades. When he later stood in diplomatic halls in Europe, it was there. When he argued over national policy, it was there. When he entered the White House, it was there. Perhaps the wound occasionally reminded him of itself through pain. Perhaps some days he barely noticed it. But the revolution had left a physical mark that success could never erase. After recovering through the winter, Monroe returned to military service. He was promoted and eventually became an aide to General William Alexander, a commander better known by the title Lord Sterling. This new role placed Monroe close to senior officers, and gave him a wider view of how armies were managed. He carried messages, observed decisions, and moved between commanders during campaigns. The work demanded courage of a different kind. An aide might not always stand in the front line, but he traveled through dangerous ground, carrying information that could affect hundreds or thousands of men. The following year brought more fighting and more disappointment. Monroe took part in the campaign around Philadelphia and saw battles at Brandywine and Germantown. Both ended badly for the Americans. The Revolution had survived Trenton, but one victory had not transformed the war into an easy path. Monroe watched other young officers wounded, including the Marquis de Lafayette, whose own blood joined that of countless soldiers scattered across fields and roads. War rarely moves in the clean direction that later maps suggest. Men fight, retreat, regroup, and often discover that courage does not guarantee success. By the end of 1777, Washington led the Continental Army into winter quarters at Valley Forge. There was no great battle waiting there, only cold, hunger, sickness, and time. Soldiers built rough wooden huts and tried to make them into shelter. Clothing wore out. Food became scarce. Disease moved through the camp with more patience than any enemy army. Monroe shared the hardship with men who had once believed the most difficult test would come under gunfire. Instead, some of the worst suffering arrived quietly, through empty stomachs, frozen ground, fever, and long nights. His old schoolmate, John Marshall, was there as well. Years earlier, they had been students learning classical texts and imagining futures that had not yet taken shape. Now, they were young soldiers trying to stay warm in a military camp. There is something almost dreamlike about that distance. Two boys who once shared lessons now shared the experience of watching men weaken from disease and hunger. Around them, soldiers died without ever seeing another major battle. The Revolution demanded not only bravery in moments of action, but endurance during months when nothing seemed to happen except suffering. Monroe survived Valley Forge, as did the Army. By the summer of 1778, American forces were stronger, more disciplined, and more capable of standing against British regulars. Monroe took part in the battle at Monmouth, moving through intense heat while carrying orders and assisting senior command. The battle ended without a decisive victory, but the Continental Army had changed. It no longer looked like a temporary collection of frightened volunteers. Years of hardship had shaped it into something more durable. Monroe had changed as well. The teenager from Virginia was becoming a seasoned officer. Yet the next challenge would not come from an enemy musket. It would come from waiting. Monroe wanted a command of his own. Washington supported him and recommended him for greater responsibility. But the Army had limited resources, and no new regiment was available for him to lead. After years of danger and constant movement, he returned to Virginia with rank but without soldiers. For a young man who had built his identity around service, the emptiness must have been difficult. Sometimes the hardest moment comes after surviving everything, when life suddenly becomes quiet and no one tells you what to do next. The quiet that followed Monroe home from the Army was not the peace he had imagined. For years, every day had carried an order, a destination, a danger, or a purpose. Now, he possessed rank without a regiment, and ambition without a clear direction. His uncle, Joseph Jones, saw the frustration before it hardened into bitterness. Jones understood that a life of service did not have to remain tied to a sword. If the battlefield had closed one road, another could still open through books, law, and government. He introduced Monroe to Thomas Jefferson. In the spring of 1780, Monroe began studying law under Jefferson in Richmond. The relationship quickly became more than formal instruction. Jefferson was already known for the Declaration of Independence, but to Monroe, he was also a working governor, carrying the daily weight of a state still at war. Monroe watched decisions being made when supplies were scarce and information arrived late. He saw that leadership was often less dramatic than battle. Sometimes it meant reading letters by candlelight, choosing between imperfect options and accepting responsibility for consequences no one could fully predict. Jefferson exposed him to arguments about Republican government, liberty, the limits of power, and the proper relationship between states and national authority. Monroe had already risked his life for independence, but now he began asking what independence was supposed to become. Winning a revolution was one problem. Building a government that could survive victory was another. Those conversations mattered, because the country being born around them still had no settled shape. The war had created a common enemy, but peace would eventually reveal how differently Americans imagined freedom once they had to govern themselves. Even while Monroe studied, war kept reaching back into his life. British forces moved through Virginia, and in early 1781, Benedict Arnold led an attack on Richmond. Arnold had once fought for the American cause, and now wore the uniform of its enemy, a reminder that loyalty could change under pressure. Monroe helped with efforts to move government records and protect the administration as danger approached. The moment must have felt strangely familiar. He had left the army, yet the revolution still seemed unwilling to let him become only a student. By autumn, however, the long conflict was finally bending toward its end. Lord Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, and major fighting in America largely faded. Monroe had not stood at the center of that final scene, but he had already given years of his youth to the cause. When the guns became quieter, he returned to the work waiting in front of him. He completed his legal preparation and was admitted to the Virginia bar. In 1782, the wounded officer was becoming a lawyer, though the courtroom would never fully satisfy him. Politics drew him almost immediately. With help from Joseph Jones, Monroe entered the Virginia House of Delegates and soon moved into the Council of State. Public service had found him again, this time without a uniform. The skills were different, but some instincts remained the same. Listen carefully, understand where people stand, decide when to compromise, and when to hold position. The battlefield had taught him that confusion could destroy a plan. Government taught a similar lesson more quietly. Laws, alliances, and institutions could fail when men stopped understanding one another. In 1783, Monroe was chosen to serve in the Continental Congress. The new nation was independent, but independence had not made it stable. Congress moved from city to city and struggled with debt, Western lands, diplomacy, and the weakness of the national system. Monroe served on committees and traveled beyond the Appalachian Mountains, seeing territory that Eastern politicians discussed more often than they visited. The scale of the country impressed him, so did its uncertainty. America had gained enormous possibility, but possibility without structure could easily become another form of disorder. Those years taught Monroe the slower craft of politics. Military orders were clear, compared with legislative negotiation. In Congress, people could agree on the goal and still fight over every road leading toward it. He learned how coalitions formed, how regional interests shaped national arguments, and how patience could accomplish what force could not. He was not always the most brilliant thinker in every room, and he did not need to be. His strength increasingly came from judgment, persistence, and the ability to work through difficult relationships without abandoning the larger purpose. While serving in New York, Monroe met Elizabeth Courtwright, the daughter of a successful merchant. She came from a world different from the rural Virginia of his childhood. She was polished, socially confident, and familiar with the manners of a commercial city. Monroe had spent much of his youth among soldiers, lawyers, and politicians. With Elizabeth, another part of life opened. They married in 1786. History would later surround Monroe with offices and treaties, but behind those public years stood a marriage that would endure political disappointment, separation, financial trouble, and repeated moves. The couple returned to Virginia and settled in Fredericksburg. Where Monroe established a law practice, he could do the work well enough. But law was more livelihood than calling. The larger questions kept pulling him back. What kind of government could hold together states with different economies and interests? How much authority should rest in one central power? How could liberty be protected from the government created to defend it? These were not distant philosophical puzzles. The young republic was discovering that winning freedom did not settle the argument over how freedom should be organized. When a new constitution emerged from the convention in Philadelphia, Monroe approached it with caution. He did not reject stronger government simply because it was stronger. His concern centered on what was missing. The proposed system contained powerful institutions, but it did not yet contain an explicit Bill of Rights. To Monroe, a government built without clearly stated protections for individual liberty carried a danger that could not be dismissed. At the Virginia Ratifying Convention in 1788, he joined men who demanded stronger safeguards before placing complete trust in the new framework. The debate placed him opposite James Madison, an old friend whose judgment he respected. That tension would become familiar throughout Monroe's life. Friendship did not always mean agreement, and disagreement did not always require hatred. Virginia eventually ratified the Constitution after supporters promised that amendments protecting basic rights would follow. Monroe lost the immediate argument, but not his place in public life. The next year, he ran against Madison for a seat in the new Congress. Madison won. Monroe accepted defeat, continued forward, and waited for another opening. It came sooner than expected. When a Virginia seat in the United States Senate became vacant in 1790, the state legislature selected Monroe to fill it. At 32 years old, the former student, wounded soldier, law apprentice, and young legislator entered the national government created by the Constitution he had once viewed with suspicion. The irony was difficult to miss. He was now responsible for helping operate the very system he had questioned. And almost immediately, he would discover that the revolution had not ended political conflict. It had merely changed its clothing. The Senate introduced Monroe to a different kind of war. There were no frozen rivers now, no muskets, no wounded men lying in the road. Yet the struggle could be just as personal. The new republic had barely begun, and already powerful men disagreed over what it should become. Some wanted a strong national government capable of directing finance, trade, and development. Others feared that too much central power would slowly recreate the kind of authority Americans had fought to escape. Monroe entered this argument not as an observer, but as a committed participant. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists. They believed the young nation needed stronger financial institutions, closer commercial ties with Britain, and a government energetic enough to shape economic growth. On the other side stood Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and the Democratic Republicans, who worried that such policies favored wealthy commercial interests and weakened the states. Monroe placed himself firmly with Jefferson and Madison. The friendships of his youth were becoming political alliances, and political alliances were becoming something more permanent. The revolution had ended, but Americans were still arguing over the meaning of its victory. Monroe opposed Hamilton on questions of debt, banking, tariffs, and federal authority. Yet the disagreement soon moved beyond policy. In 1792, Monroe and two other members of Congress examined suspicions that Hamilton had improperly used public money. The evidence led them toward payments involving a man named James Reynolds. When confronted, Hamilton admitted that money had changed hands, but insisted the reason was not corruption. The explanation he offered was far more private. He had been involved with Reynolds' wife, Maria, and the payments were connected to blackmail rather than theft from the government. Hamilton showed personal letters to prove his account. The investigation ended without establishing financial corruption, and Monroe agreed that the matter should remain private. But secrets have a way of developing lives beyond the people who first hold them. Years later, details of the affair became public. Hamilton believed Monroe had played a role in the leak. Monroe denied it, Anger grew until the two men came close to settling the dispute through a duel. Intermediaries prevented the confrontation from going further. But the episode revealed how quickly politics in the new republic could become deeply personal. It is easy to imagine the founders as marble figures, speaking calmly about constitutions and liberty. The reality was less polished. They were ambitious men with pride, grudges, friendships, fears, and tempers. They accused one another of dangerous motives. They worried that rivals might destroy the republic. Sometimes they nearly reached for weapons. Monroe was learning that public life did not make human weakness disappear. It often magnified it. The same men capable of discussing the future of a nation could also become consumed by suspicion over a letter, an insult, or a wounded reputation. By 1794, Monroe had become a visible opponent of the Washington administration that made the next decision surprising. President George Washington needed a new representative in France, and he chose Monroe. On the surface, the appointment seemed strange. Why send a political critic to represent an administration he often opposed? But Washington understood that France trusted men associated with Jefferson and the Republican cause. Relations between the two countries were becoming unstable, and Monroe might be able to reassure the French that America had not forgotten the friendship formed during the Revolution. Monroe sailed for France with Elizabeth and arrived in Paris during one of the most turbulent periods in European history. The French Revolution had torn apart old institutions, executed a king, and sent political factions against one another with terrifying speed. The guillotine had become a symbol of a revolution that could consume its own supporters. Monroe entered that atmosphere, carrying instructions that were almost impossible to balance. He was expected to reassure France of American friendship, while also preserving American neutrality between France and Britain. Warmth was required, but not commitment. Sympathy was useful, but only to a point. When Monroe presented himself before the French government, he spoke with enthusiasm about the shared spirit of the American and French revolutions. The audience responded warmly. For a time, he became remarkably popular in Paris. Perhaps this felt natural to him. He had fought in a revolution himself. He understood the language of republican ideals and resistance to monarchy. But diplomacy is rarely the same as personal belief. A representative may feel one thing while being required to defend another. Monroe soon discovered how uncomfortable that distance could become when policy in Washington moved away from his own sympathies. The greatest problem came from an agreement between the United States and Britain. The Washington administration hoped the treaty would settle disputes and prevent another war with the British. France saw the agreement very differently. From the French perspective, America appeared to be moving closer to the very country that France was fighting. Monroe was placed in the difficult position of defending a policy he did not fully support. He had been sent to build trust. Yet he had not been given all the information needed to prepare the French for what was coming. When details of the treaty became public, anger in France deepened. French authorities began taking action against American shipping, and Monroe struggled to keep the relationship from collapsing. Every explanation seemed to create another question. How could he promise friendship while his own government pursued closer arrangements with Britain? How could he defend a treaty he personally disliked? Perhaps the most exhausting positions in life are those where loyalty points in opposite directions. Monroe wanted to serve his country, but he also believed that the policy he was asked to explain was damaging the friendship he had been sent to protect. Back in America, Washington and his advisors increasingly believed that Monroe had become too sympathetic to France and had failed to represent the administration firmly enough. In 1796, he was recalled to Monroe. The decision felt like betrayal. He believed he had been handed contradictory instructions, denied important information, and then blamed when the mission became impossible. After years of trying to hold together a relationship between two suspicious governments, he was coming home not as a celebrated diplomat, But as a man forced to defend his own conduct, Monroe and Elizabeth returned to America in 1797. He discovered that his reputation had already been attacked in the press. Anger replaced disappointment. He prepared a lengthy public defense of his mission, explaining his decisions and criticizing the administration that had recalled him. The document was not gentle. Monroe believed his honor had been damaged, and he responded as a man who had spent much of his life refusing to remain silent when he felt wrongly judged. The decision widened the break between him and Washington, and the two men never fully repaired their relationship before Washington died. Yet, political defeat has a strange habit of changing meaning, depending on who is watching. Among Federalists, Monroe looked reckless and partisan. Among Democratic Republicans, he appeared courageous, a man willing to challenge even George Washington when he believed principle required it. The controversy that damaged him in one circle strengthened him in another. By 1799, Monroe had returned fully to Virginia politics. The wounded soldier, who had once struggled to find a command, now carried decades of experience in war, law, Congress, and diplomacy. Virginia elected him governor, and another difficult chapter was quietly beginning. Becoming governor of Virginia brought Monroe closer to home, but it did not bring him away from contradiction. The office was less powerful than the title might suggest. The legislature controlled much of public policy, leaving the governor with limited authority to act independently. Still, Monroe treated the position seriously. He supported stronger militia preparation, better roads, improved transportation, and wider access to education. After years spent arguing about distant nations and federal power, he was once again dealing with the ordinary machinery of government, the slow work of keeping a state functioning from one day to the next. Then, in the summer of 1800, a different kind of crisis reached Richmond. An enslaved blacksmith named Gabriel had helped organize a plan for rebellion. The conspiracy reportedly involved many enslaved people who hoped to march toward the capital, seize weapons, and challenge the system that held them in bondage. For white Virginia, the discovery produced immediate fear. For the enslaved, the plot revealed something that had always existed beneath plantation life. The people forced to work those fields were not simply part of the landscape. They had memories, anger, families, ambitions, and a desire to be free. The planned uprising was exposed before it could fully begin. Monroe called out the militia, and authorities searched for those involved. Arrests followed, trials followed, executions followed. Gabriel and more than 24 others were eventually put to death. The government restored order, at least in the way governments usually define order. Yet the deeper problem remained untouched. The rebellion had not created the fear surrounding slavery. It had revealed it. Virginia. Society depended upon forced labor while constantly worrying that those being forced might someday refuse. Security and injustice had become tied together in a knot no one wanted to untangle. Monroe understood enough to recognize that slavery carried danger, as well as moral unease. Like many men of his generation, he sometimes imagined gradual solutions somewhere in the future. But imagining change is easier than accepting the cost of change in the present. His own property and social position remained connected to enslaved labor. The same man who had once crossed an icy river for political liberty now governed a state where liberty depended greatly upon who was asking for it. History rarely gives us people whose principles and behavior fit together without friction. Monroe was no exception. The response to Gabriel's conspiracy made restrictions on enslaved people even harsher. White families wanted reassurance. Lawmakers wanted control. The system protected itself. Perhaps this is one of the darkest patterns in human affairs. When an unjust structure creates resistance, those who benefit from the structure can treat the resistance as proof that stronger control is necessary. Fear becomes its own argument. Monroe did not invent that world, but he lived comfortably enough inside it to preserve it. The problem would pass from his generation to another, becoming larger, each time the nation expanded westward. Yet, while one unresolved question remained beneath American life, another opportunity was opening across the ocean. By 1803, Thomas Jefferson was president, and France controlled an enormous territory west of the Mississippi River. Napoleon Bonaparte had ambitions in Europe and needed money for war. Suddenly, land that American leaders had considered difficult to obtain appeared available for purchase. Jefferson sent Monroe back to France as a special representative, asking him to work with Robert Livingston. Once again, Monroe found himself crossing the Atlantic toward a negotiation whose consequences were far larger than anyone could clearly measure. Paris had changed since his earlier mission, and so had Monroe. He was no longer the diplomat struggling to balance affection for revolutionary France against the instructions of George Washington. He arrived with years of additional political experience and a clearer sense of what his government needed. Livingston had already begun discussions by the time Monroe reached the city. What followed moved with surprising speed. The France was not simply willing to discuss a limited arrangement around New Orleans. Napoleon was prepared to sell the much larger Louisiana territory. The possibility seemed almost too large to fit inside the original instructions. The price was $15 million, an enormous amount for the young republic, but small beside the scale of what was being acquired. The territory covered roughly 828,000 square miles and stretched across a vast portion of the continent. With signatures and financial arrangements, the United States suddenly claimed to land almost equal in size to what it already possessed. Maps changed. Before most citizens could understand what the change meant, rivers, plains, forests, native homelands, trading routes, and distant horizons were placed beneath a new national claim. Monroe had spent much of his youth moving through a narrow world of Virginia plantations, military camps, and eastern cities. Now, he was helping enlarge the country toward spaces he could barely imagine in full. The achievement brought admiration. When news reached home, Jefferson was pleased. Supporters celebrated. Monroe returned once again as a man whose usefulness seemed almost impossible to exhaust. Yet expansion always has more than one story. Americans sought land and possibility. Native peoples already living there saw a government extending its claims toward their homes. Opportunity for one population could become pressure upon another. There was also another question, waiting inside the new territory. What would slavery move west with the nation? The purchase had solved one strategic problem while enlarging a moral one that had never disappeared. This pattern would follow American growth for decades. Every new region seemed to carry the same argument forward. Who would govern it? Who would own the land? Who would be free there? Monroe could not yet know how violently those questions would return, but the future was already hidden inside the triumph. Great national achievements often cast shadows that become visible only after the celebrations have ended. Jefferson soon sent Monroe to Britain, where the work was less satisfying. American ships were caught in the struggle between Britain and Napoleonic France. British vessels stopped American ships and forced sailors into British service, claiming some were deserters from the Royal Navy. For Americans, the practice felt like an insult to sovereignty. Monroe spent years trying to reduce these tensions. He negotiated an agreement, but Jefferson rejected it because the issue of forced service at sea had not been resolved strongly enough. Once again, diplomacy brought him close to success without allowing him to control the final decision. Monroe returned to Virginia, carrying both achievement and disappointment. For a time, he considered whether the presidency might be his next path. But James Madison had Jefferson's support. Challenging, an old friend could divide the political family Monroe had spent decades helping build. He chose not to force the contest and stepped back into private life. Perhaps he believed the long sequence of public duties was finally slowing. He had been soldier, lawyer, legislator, senator, governor, and diplomat. There were fields to manage, debts to consider, a wife and children who had spent years sharing him with public service. But history rarely allowed James Monroe to remain private for long. Relations with Britain were deteriorating. American ships continued to face interference. Sailors continued to be taken. Frontier communities blamed British influence for violence in the West. Anger moved through Congress and newspapers, and another generation began talking about war with the same confidence Monroe had once heard in Williamsburg. In 1811, President Madison asked his old friend to become Secretary of State. Monroe accepted. More than 3 decades after he had first carried a weapon for the Republic, he was about to help guide that republic toward war again. When James Monroe returned to national service in 1811, the country he had helped build was approaching another dangerous edge. President James Madison appointed him Secretary of State, placing foreign affairs in the hands of a man who had already spent years negotiating with France and Britain. Monroe was no longer the young diplomat who had once arrived in Paris filled with revolutionary enthusiasm. He was in his early 50s now, gray beginning to show in his hair, carrying the patience of experience and the knowledge that nations could drift toward war, even while their leaders continued speaking of peace. The argument with Britain had been growing for years. British warships stopped American vessels at sea. Sailors were taken from American ships and forced into British service. Trade was restricted as Europe remained trapped in conflict along the western frontier. Many Americans believed Britain was encouraging native resistance against expanding settlements. Each incident added another layer of anger. Newspapers filled with accusations. Politicians spoke of honor. Younger members of Congress demanded action. Monroe understood what military language eventually meant in human terms. Because unlike many voices calling for war, he had already been wounded in what he continued searching for a diplomatic solution. But the space for compromise kept narrowing. By the summer of 1812, Madison concluded that negotiation had failed. Congress declared war against Britain. Monroe now faced a strange reversal of his own life. Decades earlier, he had carried a musket against British troops as a teenager. Now, he sat at the center of government, helping manage the diplomatic consequences of another conflict with the same empire. Nations change slowly enough that old enemies sometimes return, wearing new circumstances, and men who survive long enough can find themselves fighting variations of the same argument twice. The war did not begin with the triumph many Americans expected. Attempts to invade Canada failed. British naval power tightened around the coast. Military planning exposed weaknesses that patriotic speeches had concealed. Soldiers lacked training. Supplies arrived unevenly. Commanders disagreed, and the young republic discovered that confidence was not the same thing as preparation. Monroe watched these failures from Washington with growing concern. He understood administration too well to mistake good intentions for competence. A government could possess brave soldiers and still lose battles if orders arrived late, supplies failed, or leadership collapsed at the wrong moment. By 1814, the danger moved toward the capital itself. British forces entered the Chesapeake region and advanced toward Washington. The threat should have produced urgency, yet preparations remained dangerously weak. Monroe went personally toward Bladensburg in Maryland to observe the defensive positions. What he found offered little comfort. American forces were poorly arranged and lacked the organization needed to stop experienced British troops. When the attack came, the defense broke apart. Militia units retreated in confusion. Monroe escaped the collapse, but the road behind him now lay open toward the seat of the national government. British troops entered Washington and set fire to important public buildings, including the Capitol and the president's residence. Flames rose above the city, where the young government had tried to present itself as permanent. For Americans, the humiliation was difficult to describe. This was not some distant fort being lost on a remote frontier. The enemy had walked into the Capitol and burned the physical symbols of the Republic. Monroe had once watched the Revolutionary Army retreat across New Jersey. Now, nearly 4 decades later, he was witnessing another moment when American survival seemed less secure than national pride had suggested. Crisis, stripped away ceremony. Madison placed greater responsibility for military affairs on Monroe, and for a period, he carried the burdens of both foreign policy and the War Department. Once again, the old soldier beneath the statesman returned to the surface. There was little time for elegant theory. Baltimore might be attacked next. Defenses had to be strengthened. Troops had to be organized. Information had to move faster. Monroe worked through the confusion with the habits he had developed across a lifetime of public service. When systems failed, he tried to make the next decision more orderly than the last. Baltimore was better prepared when British forces turned toward it. American resistance held, and the bombardment of Fort McHenry failed to break the defense. The war still had no simple ending, but the mood began to change. While guns continued firing, diplomats were already negotiating across the Atlantic in Ghent. Monroe, serving as Secretary of State, helped coordinate the American position from home. The contrast was familiar. Soldiers fought because agreements had failed, while diplomats searched for agreements because fighting could not continue forever. Eventually, nearly every war returns to a table. Even after thousands have paid for the delay, the Treaty of Ghent was signed in December of 1814. It largely restored conditions to what they had been before the war. Territory did not dramatically change hands, and many disputes that had helped cause the conflict were not clearly resolved by the document itself. Yet, to exhausted Americans, peace felt like victory. Then came news from New Orleans, where Andrew Jackson had defeated a British force in a dramatic battle, fought before word of the treaty had reached the armies. The timing gave the end of the war an almost theatrical quality, as though national confidence arrived just after peace had already been signed. Monroe emerged from the crisis with greater stature. When Washington had been threatened, he had not withdrawn into the safety of an office. When military administration faltered, he accepted additional responsibility. When Baltimore needed stronger preparation, he helped bring order to the defense. The war had exposed serious weaknesses in the country, but it had also returned Monroe to a role he had known since youth. He was the man who stepped forward when institutions were under pressure. By the time peace settled over the Republic, his name seemed naturally connected to the question of who should lead next. In 1816, the presidential contest unfolded with far less uncertainty than many earlier elections. The Federalist Party had been badly weakened, partly by its opposition to the war and by suspicions surrounding its wartime political activities. Within Monroe's own political family, there were other ambitions, but he carried the support of Madison and Jefferson, along with a public record that stretched back to the Revolution. He had been soldier, legislator, senator, governor, diplomat, Secretary of State, and wartime administrator. The path to the presidency now looked less like a sudden rise than the final stair in a very long climb. Monroe won the election comfortably and prepared to become the 5th President of the United States. When he took office in the spring of 1817, he was 58 years old. He still dressed in a style that belonged to an earlier generation, wearing the formal clothing associated with the Revolutionary era. Long after fashions had begun to change, there was symbolism in the image. Standing before a younger nation was one of the last presidents who had personally carried a weapon in the struggle that created it. The revolution was becoming history, but Monroe still wore part of it on his body and in his manner. His first message as president emphasized unity. The fierce political divisions that had shaped the previous decades seemed to be weakening, and Monroe hoped the country might move beyond permanent faction. It was an appealing dream after years of bitter elections, newspaper attacks, international tension, and war. Perhaps a nation that had survived so much could finally learn to breathe more quietly. Perhaps Americans could disagree without treating every disagreement as a threat to the Republic. For a short time, the possibility seemed real, but beneath that calm surface were older questions, waiting patiently for another moment to rise. Monroe entered the presidency, believing that experience might help him hold those tensions together. He had seen government from almost every angle. He knew how quickly confidence could become panic, how easily friendship could become rivalry, and how dangerous it was to confuse temporary peace with permanent agreement. The country was expanding. Its economy was changing. Slavery remained unresolved. Western settlement was pushing into new lands. Europe was still watching the young republic. Monroe had reached the highest office of his life, but history had not rewarded him with rest. It had simply given him a larger room in which to worry. The White House did not make James Monroe a different man. It simply gave his habits more space to operate. He rose early, often before the city had fully awakened, and began the day by reading newspapers and government correspondence. He wanted to know what people were saying beyond Washington, not only what advisors believed he should hear. After breakfast, he moved into the steady rhythm of official work. Letters, reports, appointments, petitions, foreign questions, military concerns. The presidency was less a throne than an endless table covered with unfinished problems. Monroe preferred order. Papers were arranged carefully. Letters were read closely. Decisions were rarely made in a sudden burst of emotion. He had spent too many years watching confusion create unnecessary disaster. In military camps, disorder could cost lives. In government, it could cost trust. He listened longer than some politicians expected, often allowing advisors to argue through a question before revealing his own conclusion. This patience sometimes made him appear slow, but it also gave people the sense that their opinions had been heard. For Monroe, governing was often the art of lowering the temperature before choosing a direction. His cabinet reflected that instinct. He surrounded himself with men from different regions and political backgrounds, hoping talent could matter more than old factional loyalties. John Quincy Adams became Secretary of State. John Calhoun took responsibility for the War Department. William Crawford managed the Treasury. Monroe did not expect these men to agree on everything. In fact, disagreement was part of the usefulness of having strong advisors. He wanted arguments inside the room before decisions reached the country. Unity, in his mind, did not mean silence. It meant conflict that remained inside the boundaries of a shared national purpose. Cabinet meetings could continue for hours. Monroe usually listened while each man explained his position, then asked questions until the disagreement became clearer. He did not possess the theatrical brilliance of some earlier leaders. He was not trying to dominate every room with personality. His strength was quieter. People often trusted him because he seemed to take responsibility seriously without needing to make every decision a performance. He had learned across decades that public life already contained enough vanity. Sometimes the most useful person at the table was the one willing to listen until everyone else had finished speaking. His days were long, and the presidency followed him into the evening. Visitors arrived, seeking offices, favors, answers, or influence. Members of Congress came to discuss legislation. Foreign representatives carried the concerns of distant governments into rooms filled with American maps. Monroe received them with a formality that belonged partly to another age. He remained courteous, even when he intended to refuse a request. People who left disappointed often still believed they had been treated fairly. Perhaps this was one reason his presidency began with such unusual goodwill. He made political respect feel personal before turning it into policy. Elizabeth brought a different atmosphere to the social life of the presidential household. Years spent in Europe had shaped her sense of ceremony, and official dinners could feel more formal than Washington society had known under Dolly Madison. Some visitors admired the elegance. Others found the reserve uncomfortable. Monroe defended his wife when criticism appeared. He knew that public office had already demanded much from their marriage. She had crossed oceans, endured long separations, lived through financial uncertainty, and watched his duties repeatedly claim his attention. The presidency belonged to the nation, but their marriage still belonged to them. Beneath all this formality, Monroe remained attached to the identity of the revolutionary generation. His clothing looked old-fashioned. Even in his own time, knee breeches, buckled shoes, and the carefully controlled manners of an earlier era made him appear like a figure who had stepped out of the founding years and refused to change costume. Perhaps that was partly intentional. He had been wounded in the Revolution. He had known Washington and Jefferson personally. The old style was not merely fashion. It reminded people that the president standing before them had once been a young officer fighting for the existence of the country. Soon after taking office, Monroe decided that unity could not be created only from behind a desk. He began a long journey through the northern states, visiting communities that had once been strongholds of Federalist opposition. Presidents did not travel casually in those years. Roads were rough, distances exhausting, accommodations uncertain. But Monroe wanted people to see him in person. He inspected military defenses, met local officials, attended public dinners, and entered towns where voters had once viewed his political allies with suspicion. The journey became less about administration and more about showing that the presidency belonged to more than one faction. The reception surprised even some of his supporters. Crowds gathered along streets. Local leaders welcomed him. Former political opponents attended dinners in his honor. In Boston, once a center of Federalist resistance, the president was greeted with warmth instead of hostility. Newspapers began describing the atmosphere as an era of good feelings. The phrase spread because it expressed something many Americans wanted to believe. After revolution, bitter party conflict, diplomatic crises, and another war with Britain. Perhaps the country had finally grown tired of treating every political disagreement as a struggle for national survival. For a short while, the hope seemed reasonable. The Federalist Party was collapsing. The Democratic Republicans dominated national politics. The old party lines appeared to be fading. Monroe imagined that organized faction itself might eventually disappear, leaving leaders to debate policies without permanent political armies behind them. It was an attractive idea, especially for a man who had spent years caught inside partisan conflict. He had seen friendships damaged by politics and reputations, destroyed by suspicion. If the country could move beyond that bitterness, perhaps public service could become less about defeating enemies and more about managing differences. But calm can hide pressure. Beneath the celebrations, the United States remained a collection of regions with very different interests. Northern communities were developing commerce and industry. Southern wealth remained deeply tied to agriculture and enslaved labor. Western settlers wanted land, roads, protection, and access to markets. Every region looked toward the same national government while asking for different things. Monroe understood that unity could not simply be declared. It had to be balanced. Every appointment, spending decision, tariff, land policy, and treaty carried consequences that could feel fair in one place and threatening in another. And there was one question that no goodwill tour could soften. Slavery continued expanding alongside the nation. Monroe had lived beside that contradiction since childhood. He had fought in the name of liberty while owning enslaved people. Now, as president, he governed a republic that celebrated freedom while denying it to millions. For the moment, national celebration kept that contradiction partly beneath the surface. But the surface was thin. The country looked peaceful. The president looked secure. And crowds spoke of unity. Somewhere ahead, however, the argument over slavery and Western expansion was waiting for the right moment to break through. The calm surrounding Monroe at home allowed him to look outward with unusual confidence. For much of his life, Foreign policy had meant surviving between stronger powers. Now the United States was larger, more secure, and increasingly willing to define its own place in the world. Monroe worked closely with John Quincy Adams, his Secretary of State. A man of disciplined intelligence and formidable experience, the two did not always approach problems in the same way. But they shared one basic instinct: America should avoid becoming dependent upon the ambitions of European governments. One of their earliest achievements appeared almost modest beside the larger events that would follow. The United States and Britain agreed to reduce military forces on the Great Lakes. Only a few years earlier, the two countries had been at war. Forts, ships, and weapons along the northern frontier had represented fear on both sides. Now, those waters could begin to resemble a boundary instead of a battlefield. There was no dramatic surrender, no cheering army, no single heroic moment. Sometimes, peace enters history quietly, through the removal of weapons that people had once believed they could never safely put away. For Monroe, the agreement carried a personal kind of meaning. He had spent his youth fighting British soldiers and his middle years trying to negotiate with British ministers. Now, an American president who still carried a revolutionary musket ball inside his shoulder was helping create a less militarized relationship with the same old enemy. Time had changed the shape of danger. Britain remained powerful, but war no longer seemed inevitable every time the two nations disagreed. The ability to live beside a former enemy without preparing constantly for another conflict was itself a sign that the Republic had matured. The more difficult problem lay to the south. Florida remained under Spanish control, but Spain was weakening. Its empire across the Americas was beginning to fracture, and authority in Florida was uncertain. American settlers complained about raids across the border. Native communities moved through territory that political maps attempted to divide more neatly than life allowed. Enslaved people, escaping from the United States, sometimes found refuge there. Every complaint became another argument for intervention. The frontier was not an empty line on a map. It was a place where different peoples carried different memories of who had the right to remain. Then, Andrew Jackson entered the problem with the force that would later define his own presidency. Commanding American troops, Jackson moved into Florida, seized Spanish positions, and ordered the execution of 2 British subjects whom he believed had encouraged resistance against the United States. The action created an international crisis. Spain protested. Britain was angry. Members of Monroe's cabinet argued over whether Jackson had gone too far. A president who had spent decades learning the importance of restraint now had to decide what to do with a general whose success often came from acting before anyone could restrain him. Monroe could have publicly condemned Jackson and withdrawn from what he had done. Instead, he and Adams recognized that the crisis had revealed a larger truth. Spain could protest American intrusion, but it was increasingly unable to control Florida itself. Adams argued that the United States should turn Jackson's aggression into diplomatic pressure. Negotiations intensified. The message to Spain was difficult to ignore. If the Spanish government could not secure the territory or control events there, transferring Florida might be preferable to watching American power continue to move across the border without permission. The resulting agreement gave Florida to the United States and clarified important boundaries stretching westward from the Louisiana Territory. In exchange, the American government accepted financial responsibilities connected to claims against Spain. On a map, the change appeared clean. Another piece of territory became part of the expanding republic, but maps rarely show the full cost of expansion. Native peoples living in those regions did not suddenly experience themselves as Americans because diplomats changed a boundary. National growth brought settlement, military pressure, removal, and the gradual destruction of older ways of life that stood in the path of expansion. This was one of the central contradictions of Monroe's America. The nation described expansion as opportunity. Settlers imagined farms, towns, roads, and futures for their children. Government officials saw stronger borders and greater security. Yet, the same movement meant dispossession for Native communities. Monroe could speak sincerely about Republican liberty while supporting policies that narrowed the freedom of people outside the political community he imagined. He was not unusual in this. That was precisely the problem. Some of history's deepest injustices survive, not because a few people believe in them, but because an entire society learns not to see the contradiction. While America expanded across the continent, another transformation was taking place farther south. Spanish colonies throughout Latin America were fighting for independence. New governments appeared, where imperial authority had once seemed permanent. To Monroe, the events must have carried an echo of his own youth. Half a century earlier, 13 colonies on the Atlantic coast had challenged a European empire. Now other peoples in the Western Hemisphere were doing something similar, but sympathy alone could not determine American policy. Europe remained powerful, and rumors suggested that monarchies might help Spain recover some of its former colonies. Britain also opposed any large European effort to restore Spanish control, partly because British merchants benefited from trade with the newly independent nations. British officials suggested that the United States and Britain might make a joint declaration, warning European powers against intervention. The proposal was tempting. Britain possessed the naval strength that could make such a warning meaningful. Yet, John Quincy Adams urged a different course. America should speak for itself. Joining Britain might offer immediate protection, but it could also make the young republic appear to be following behind another empire. Monroe accepted the argument. In his annual message to Congress in December of 1823, he laid out principles that would later be known as the Monroe Doctrine. The United States would regard further European colonization in the Americas as unacceptable. It would view attempts by European powers to extend their political systems into the Western Hemisphere as dangerous to American peace and security. At the same time, the United States would not interfere in existing European colonies or involve itself unnecessarily in the internal struggles of Europe. Two worlds, the message suggested, were beginning to follow different political paths. At the moment it was announced, the declaration was more confident than American military power could fully support. The United States did not possess the strength to prevent every European intervention on its own. British naval power remained an important practical barrier against any major attempt to reconquer Latin America. Yet, declarations sometimes become more powerful with time than they were when first spoken. Later generations would reinterpret Monroe's words, expand them, misuse them, and invoke them to justify policies he could never have imagined. His name became attached permanently to a principle shaped through collaboration with Adams. Monroe had reached another summit. Borders were becoming more secure. Florida had entered the Union. Relations with Britain were calmer. European powers had been warned that the political future of the Americas could not simply be decided in royal courts across the Atlantic. From a distance, the presidency seemed almost remarkably successful. Yet the most dangerous threat to national unity was not approaching from London, Madrid, Paris, or any foreign capital. It was already inside the country. It had been there since Monroe's childhood in Virginia, hidden beneath talk of liberty and expansion. As new territories moved toward statehood, an old question became impossible to postpone. Would slavery expand with the nation? Every new state could alter the political balance between regions where slavery was legal and regions where it was not. Suddenly, the map was no longer only about land, it was about power. The era of good feelings had created the impression that party conflict was disappearing. But beneath that calm surface, the Union was beginning to divide along a deeper line. Monroe had helped strengthen America against foreign pressure. Now, he would face a crisis. No treaty with another nation could solve. The crisis arrived, not with foreign soldiers or ships, but with an application for statehood. In 1819, Missouri asked to enter the Union while allowing slavery. On paper, it appeared to be another step in the country growing westward. In Washington, however, the request touched something far more dangerous. There were 11 free states and 11 slave states, creating a delicate balance in the Senate. Admitting Missouri as a slave state would disturb that balance. Suddenly, a question the nation had repeatedly postponed was sitting openly before Congress. Northern representatives argued that slavery should not simply spread wherever the country expanded. Representative James Tallmadge proposed restrictions that would prevent more enslaved people from being brought into Missouri and would eventually free children born into slavery there. The House approved his proposal. The Senate rejected it. What followed was months of bitter argument. Politicians who had recently spoken of national harmony began speaking as representatives of competing regions. The old party divisions seemed less important now. Another division, older and deeper, was beginning to organize the country around geography, labor, power, and human bondage. Monroe watched the dispute with growing unease. He had spent his presidency trying to reduce political hostility. Yet this argument could not be softened by goodwill, dinners, or careful appointments. The North feared that slave-holding states would gain too much political power. The South feared that restricting slavery in new territories would eventually threaten slavery where it already existed. Each side believed the other was changing the terms of the Union. Compromise became harder, because the question was no longer only about Missouri. It was about what kind of nation America would become as it moved west. The solution came through a carefully constructed bargain. Maine would enter as a free state, while Missouri would enter as a slave state, preserving the balance in the Senate. Congress also drew a geographic line across the remaining Louisiana territory. North of 36 degrees and 30 minutes, latitude slavery would generally be prohibited, except within Missouri. Monroe quietly supported the agreement and signed it into law in 1820. For the moment, Congress had found a way to move forward. The immediate fire seemed contained, but contained fire is not the same thing as extinguished fire. Thomas Jefferson, now an old man watching events from Virginia, described the Missouri dispute as something like an alarm heard in the darkness. He understood that a geographic line had not answered the moral question. It had only given politicians a way to postpone it. Monroe understood that too. Even if he hoped time might somehow produce a gentler solution, like many members of the founding generation, he could recognize slavery as a contradiction while continuing to benefit from it personally. The Republic had learned to speak against bondage, without yet learning how to surrender the system. That contradiction followed Monroe everywhere. He had been wounded, fighting for independence. He had spent a lifetime describing liberty as one of the foundations of Republican government. Yet, enslaved people lived and worked on his own property. He supported gradual ideas of emancipation in theory, but did little to transform theory into personal action. This was not merely an individual inconsistency. It was woven throughout the political culture of his generation. They feared slavery, depended upon slavery, criticized slavery, defended arrangements that preserved slavery, and repeatedly handed the final reckoning to people who had not yet been born. Even as the Missouri crisis revealed the weakness beneath national unity, Monroe remained extraordinarily popular. In 1820, he stood for re-election with almost no organized opposition. The Federalist Party had nearly disappeared as a national force, and no serious challenger emerged against him. When the electoral votes were counted, only one elector chose another candidate. Monroe had come remarkably close to a unanimous victory. For a president who had spent his youth in a revolution and his middle years inside some of the most vicious political struggles of the early republic, the result must have seemed extraordinary. Yet, public approval could not protect the country from economic pain. The Panic of 1819 had already damaged families throughout the nation. Banks failed, land values fell, credit disappeared, farmers struggled with debt, merchants watched businesses collapse. People who had believed prosperity would continue discovered how quickly optimism could turn into fear when money stopped moving. Monroe had spent much of his career solving problems through administration and negotiation, but the federal government possessed few tools for responding to a depression of this kind. Suffering spread through communities. While Washington searched for answers it did not really possess. His second term, therefore, carried a different mood from the first. The ceremonies remained. Foreign policy continued to produce achievements. The president still appeared dignified and controlled, but the era of good feelings was quietly losing its name. Ambitious men inside Monroe's own political movement were already preparing for the future. John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, William Crawford, and John Calhoun represented different regions, personalities, and visions. Without a strong opposing party to contain them, competition began growing inside the Democratic-Republican coalition itself. Unity had not removed political ambition. It had merely moved ambition into the same house. Monroe tried to stand above the emerging struggle. He had spent too many years watching personal rivalry damage public life, and he did not want his final years in office consumed by choosing a successor. Age was also becoming harder to ignore. Old injuries caused pain. Years of travel, war, administration, and political tension had accumulated inside his body. The musket ball from Trenton still remained in his shoulder, a fragment of a distant winter carried into a new century. The young lieutenant who had once crossed the Delaware was now an aging president, beginning to imagine mornings without government papers waiting for him. One of the most emotional reminders of that passing generation came in 1824, when the Marquis de Lafayette returned to the United States. Decades earlier, Lafayette had fought beside the Americans during the Revolution. Now, he traveled through a country transformed beyond anything those young soldiers could have imagined. Crowds welcomed him as a living connection to independence. When Monroe greeted his old companion, the moment brought two elderly veterans face to face with their younger selves. Behind the ceremony stood a quieter truth. The men who had fought the Revolution were disappearing, and soon memory would belong mostly to others. Meanwhile, the presidential election of 1824 became increasingly bitter. 4 major candidates competed, and no one won a majority of the electoral vote. The decision moved into the House of Representatives, where John Quincy Adams was chosen, even though Andrew Jackson had received more popular and electoral votes than any other candidate. Jackson's supporters accused Adams and Henry Clay of making a corrupt bargain. Anger spread quickly. Monroe refused to enter the dispute. He had stayed neutral during the campaign, and he intended to leave the presidency without turning his final months into another personal political war. On the 4th of March in 1825, James Monroe attended the inauguration of John Quincy Adams. Then, after 8 years as president and nearly half a century of public service in one form or another, he prepared to leave Washington. He was 66 years old. He had served the country as a soldier, legislator, diplomat, governor, cabinet officer, and president. He had helped enlarge its territory and strengthen its place in the world. He had also helped postpone questions that would later return with far greater violence. Achievement and unfinished business traveled beside him as he went home. Perhaps Monroe imagined retirement as a final quiet season. There would be no cabinet waiting for decisions, no foreign ministers arriving with demands, no election beyond the horizon. Oak Hill in Virginia offered fields, familiar rooms, family, and distance from Washington. But leaving power does not erase what power has cost. Behind the public honors were debts accumulated through years of government service, property that did not produce enough income, and financial obligations that had followed him longer than political applause. Monroe was finally going home, but home would not offer the peace he had spent so many years earning. Retirement at Oak Hill was supposed to be the quiet reward at the end of a long public life. Instead, it became another season of worry. Monroe had spent decades serving in offices that often demanded more money than the government returned to him. Diplomatic life had been especially expensive. Dinners, staff, travel, clothing, and the appearance expected of an American representative had often come from his own pocket. Now the ceremonies were over, the bills remained, and the former president discovered that service could leave behind debts applause could not erase. He owned land, but land was not the same as cash. Values had fallen after the economic crisis of 1819, and his plantations did not produce enough income to satisfy what he owed. Monroe repeatedly asked Congress to reimburse expenses. He believed the government had never fully paid. Some lawmakers sympathized. Others thought he had already received enough. Eventually, Congress granted him $30,000, but even that was not enough to restore the security he had imagined for his final years. Retirement had brought him home, without bringing peace. There were still moments of purpose. Monroe joined Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in supporting the University of Virginia, one of Jefferson's most cherished projects. The three aging men met and discussed education, government, and the future of the Republic. They had spent their lives shaping. Then, on the 4th of July in 1826, Jefferson and John Adams both died. Monroe had known them both, and the coincidence left him more isolated inside his own generation. One by one, the voices that remembered the beginning were becoming silent. His health declined during the final years of the decade. A persistent cough grew worse. Fatigue came more easily. Old pain in his hand troubled him, and the energy that had carried him through campaigns, ocean crossings, cabinet meetings, and presidential journeys began to disappear. In 1829, Virginia honored him by choosing him to preside over a convention called to revise the state constitution. The honor recognized his stature, but his body could no longer obey his duty. Illness kept him away, and eventually he had to step aside. The hardest loss came not from politics or illness, but from home. In September of 1830, Elizabeth died at Oak Hill after 44 years of marriage. She had been beside Monroe through diplomacy, war, political defeat, presidential ceremony, financial struggle, and long separations. Public history often leaves a wife at the edge of the frame, but private life is arranged differently. Elizabeth had been part of the rhythm of his days for almost his entire adulthood. When she was gone, Oak Hill remained standing, but Monroe could no longer live comfortably inside its silence. His daughters feared that grief and illness would consume him if he stayed alone. Monroe finally agreed to leave Virginia and go to New York, where his daughter Maria lived with her husband. In October of 1830, he departed Oak Hill and never returned. The property that had represented home, retirement, and family stability would eventually be lost under the pressure of debt. The former president was now dependent upon the care of his child. History had reduced the distance between public greatness and ordinary human vulnerability to a single upstairs room. By winter, the illness had confined him almost completely. The cough interrupted sleep. Eating became difficult. Conversation exhausted him. In April of 1831, he wrote to James Madison and admitted that he did not expect his health to recover. He regretted that they would likely never meet again. It was a quiet farewell between two men whose friendship had survived political competition, war, public office, and half a century of national change. There were fewer people left who could remember the same roads, the same arguments, and the same uncertain beginning. In May, Monroe prepared his will. There was little wealth left to divide after his debts were considered. Near the end, he also asked that Peter Marks, an enslaved man who had served in his household for many years, be freed. The request carried a painful weight. Monroe had spoken uneasily about slavery and had lived long enough to understand its contradiction with the language of the Revolution. Yet he had remained a slaveholder. One final act could not undo a lifetime inside that system. It could only reveal how long the contradiction had followed him. Then the calendar returned to the date with which this story began. On the 4th of July in 1831, New York celebrated independence beneath the summer heat. Bells rang. Cannon salutes sounded from the harbor. Crowds moved through streets decorated for the nation's birthday. Upstairs, James Monroe struggled for breath, while Maria remained beside him. The sounds of celebration drifted into a room where one of the last presidents formed by the revolutionary generation was dying. The country outside was young and noisy. The man inside was tired, old, and almost gone. Around 3 in the afternoon, his breathing became weaker and less regular. Then it stopped. There was no final political argument to settle, and no great declaration left to deliver. James Monroe simply reached the end of the strength that had carried him for 73 years. His words spread through the city, and bells that had been ringing for celebration began to carry mourning as well. Flags were lowered. Newspapers prepared the announcement. Once again, people noticed the strange symmetry. Jefferson, Adams, and now Monroe had all died on the 4th of July. 3 days later, thousands followed his funeral procession through New York. Militia units, civic groups, officials, and ordinary citizens moved behind the hearse while bells sounded across the city. Monroe was placed in a family vault, far from the Virginia soil where his life had begun. Years later, his remains would return to Virginia. The man who had spent his life moving between armies, capitals, and countries was buried far from the home he had expected to keep. Even in death, his journey seemed unwilling to end in a simple place. What remained after him was not simple either. He had helped purchase Louisiana, secure Florida, reduce tension with Britain, guide the nation through war, and establish the principle later called the Monroe Doctrine. He had also supported expansion that displaced native peoples and belonged to a generation that proclaimed liberty while maintaining slavery. The Missouri Compromise preserved political peace for a time, but it did not heal the division beneath it. The Union he loved would eventually descend into civil war over the question his generation had repeatedly postponed. And so, the journey returns to that warm room in New York. Outside, America celebrates its birth. Inside, an old revolutionary grows quiet. The bells continue after he can no longer hear them. The nation moves forward after the generation that founded it begins to disappear. Perhaps history is more honest when it leaves us with questions. What does a person owe the future? What do nations choose not to confront? And how long can an unfinished promise wait before another generation must answer it?